It all started as a quiet act of self-care. Early mornings in the garden became my peace. I wasn't looking to make a statement. I was just planting herbs and tomatoes, some kale, onions, and a few marigolds to keep the pests away. The sun would barely rise, birds would chirp, and my hands would already be buried in soil. This wasn't politics. It was personal, but I had no idea that a simple vegetable patch in my own front yard would become the spark for a bigger fight, a fight about rights, power, and the strange ways bureaucracy works in the very county I helped govern. I've been the county commissioner for 3 years. I ran on transparency, community strength, and the promise to bring decision-making back to the people. But even someone like me, with office power and knowledge, isn't immune to pettiness, politics, or outdated regulations. It began with a letter, plain envelope, no stamp, just tucked inside my gate one morning. I opened it, expecting maybe a flyer or a neighbor's note, but it was from the Neighborhood Appearance and Code Enforcement Division. That's a fancy name for the people who send warnings when your trash can's too visible or your grass is an inch too long. One was different. It said my front yard garden violated zoning ordinances, that it disrupted community aesthetics, that I had 10 days to remove the non-compliant landscaping or face a $200 day fine. At first, I laughed. It had to be a mistake. A bad form letter sent to the wrong person. But it wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't random. Within days, my assistant forwarded me to more emails from code enforcement. And then a neighbor, someone I barely knew, started posting in the community Facebook group about certain people abusing their positions. I didn't respond. I didn't want to escalate, but it kept growing. Soon, a local news outlet reached out, asking if I had any comment on the alleged violation. That word alleged really stuck with me, as if growing food for my family was a criminal act. But here's the thing. The garden was well kept. It was tidy. It wasn't a mess. No overgrown weeds. New construction debris. No fences falling down. Just rows of thriving green, some lavender and basil for fragrance. Cherry tomatoes staked upright. Even a narrow stone path for watering. People would walk by and smile. Kids would point. It brought joy. And still, someone wanted it gone. That's when I realized this wasn't about zoning. It was about control. About reminding me that no matter who I was, someone out there didn't like me, and they were willing to use bureaucracy to try and knock me down. I spent the next day reading the actual ordinance, Section 8 to 1.4 of the Municipal Code. It said front yards should consist of approved turf or decorative landscaping unless otherwise approved. That was vague, very vague. And more importantly, I found that decorative landscaping had never been clearly defined. I then looked into permits. There were homes nearby with large rock gardens, dry beds with cacti, even a fake pond, and none of them had been cited. But they were neat, expensive looking, and not edible. Mine was edible. Mine was functional. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about beauty. It was about food, and control over who grows it and where. I called a meeting with code enforcement. I sat across from a man who looked more nervous than I did. I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't expecting to be on the other side of this conversation. He admitted, off the record, that there had been a complaint. Just one. A single complaint. And here's the kicker. The complaint didn't mention the garden being messy. It mentioned the fact that as a public official, I should set an example and not lower property values with agricultural experiments. That's when I knew this was personal, but I didn't back down. Instead, I did something I never thought I'd have to do. I held a press conference standing in front of my garden, cameras rolling. I explained what was happening. I read parts of the citation. I talked about food insecurity, the importance of local produce, and the absurdity of being fined for growing lettuce. That video went viral. People from across the country, and even other countries, started sending messages. Gardeners, teachers, chefs, activists, all saying the same thing. Thank you for standing up. One woman wrote, they fined me too, but I wasn't a commissioner. I had to tear mine out. Another said, in my town, we have community garden ordinances too, and they're meant to help people, not punish them. But the pressure worked both ways. Some of my colleagues, people I thought were allies, began to whisper that I was making a spectacle, that I was turning a personal matter into a political firestorm. They missed the point entirely. I wasn't fighting just for my own garden anymore. I was fighting for every single person who's been told they can't grow their own food because it doesn't look right. I was fighting for the families who have to rely on expensive grocery stores because zoning laws make it illegal to plant a tomato in the front yard. And I kept going. I requested a review of the entire local landscaping ordinance. I introduced a new bill, one that would explicitly legalize residential edible gardens anywhere on private property as long as they're maintained and safe. No more vague wording. No more room for abuse. At the next council meeting, I brought baskets of produce from my yard, fresh, clean, washed. I gave each council member a tomato, a pepper, and a small jar of pickled cucumbers. Tell me, I said, does this offend you more than a plastic lawn flamingo? People laughed. Some looked embarrassed. But the point hit home. Meanwhile, the fine was still hanging over my head. I didn't pay it. I challenged it through the appeals board, and I made sure it stayed public. Every filing, every meeting, I invited reporters. I wanted everyone to see what it looks like when the system turns against common sense. Behind the scenes, I was exhausted. I had late nights answering emails, angry messages, even a few threats. Stick to policy, not lettuce, one said. Another told me I was ruining the image of the neighborhood. But I also had support. Strangers left bags of compost and mulch at my gate. A group of kids from the local school painted signs that said, "Let her garden grow." It became bigger than me, and that's when something unexpected happened. The governor's office called. They had seen the story. They wanted to talk about expanding a state program that supports urban gardens. They said my case had sparked conversation at the state level. "You started something," the aide told me. By the end of that month, the citation was withdrawn, quietly, no apology. Just a short letter saying the enforcement was no longer necessary due to ordinance clarification. But I wasn't done, because this wasn't about one letter. This was about making sure no one else got that letter again. I stood there in front of my little backyard garden, staring at the fresh notice they'd stuck right on my gate. Another violation. Another warning. This time, the fine was doubled. And all because of a patch of tomatoes and some wildflowers. I'm not just a homeowner, I'm the county commissioner. I help make and enforce the very policies they're using against me. So, this time, it felt more personal. You see, my garden wasn't wild. It wasn't unsafe. There were no rats, no hazards, no broken fences. Just neat rows of kale, cucumbers, carrots, and some sunflowers I planted with my daughter. It was the kind of garden that made people smile when they passed by. But the homeowners association saw it differently. They said it violated landscaping aesthetics, that it didn't follow community uniformity. I kept asking myself, how can fresh vegetables and natural beauty be a violation? I called their office that same afternoon, expecting to have a reasonable conversation. The lady on the line, polite but firm, told me the decision had been made, and I could appeal to a committee I'd once helped elect. So I did what anyone with a sense of justice would do. I filed the appeal, not just for me, but for every person who's been harassed or silenced over something that brings them peace. A few days later, I started getting messages from neighbors. One of them, an elderly woman named Grace, said they'd fined her for having wild lavender in her front yard. Another man, Mike, who lived 2 streets over, got a citation for growing corn in raised beds on the side of his house. It hit me this wasn't about me, it was about control. The next community meeting was packed. More than I'd ever seen in the years I'd been in office. And many were there because of garden small ones, backyard ones, balcony pots even, vertical gardens on walls. When I stood up to speak, the room fell silent. I looked around and said, they tried to fine me for gardening, but I'm your county commissioner, and I won't let this happen in silence. I explained everything, how my garden was clean, maintained, and added beauty to the neighborhood. I shared photos of before and after. I showed how the vegetables were feeding local shelters, and I read messages from neighbors who supported the garden. Some people clapped, others nodded, but a few members of the HOA board looked angry. Their expressions didn't hide it. After the meeting, one of them came up to me and said, "You should have handled this quietly." But how could I, when people in our community were being bullied over plants and soil? That week, I started getting media calls. Local reporters wanted to know what was happening. Soon, my story was on the evening news. A public official being fined for a garden. It made people curious. The article went viral. The next morning, my inbox was overflowing. Messages from across the state, people sharing similar stories. One woman wrote, "They threatened me over a herb spiral I made with my son. Thank you for standing up." Another said, "I've been fined twice for native plants. Please, don't stop." It became clear this wasn't an isolated issue. It was about power and who gets to decide what's acceptable in a community. My role as commissioner didn't make me immune, it made me a target. But it also gave me a platform. So, I took action. I drafted a new proposal, something I called the Garden Freedom Ordinance. It would protect residents' rights to grow food and native plants on their own property, so long as it wasn't unsafe or a nuisance. It was rooted in environmental rights and basic human dignity. Before I submitted it to the board, I hosted a town hall. Dozens of people came. Some brought photos of their gardens, others brought petitions, and they shared their experiences, some emotional, some infuriating. One woman cried as she recalled being fined for the same flower bed her late husband had built. When it came time to present the ordinance to the county council, I wasn't alone. People stood behind me, gardeners, parents, teachers, even some former critics. I looked them in the eyes and said, "This is about more than tomatoes. It's about our right to live freely and responsibly on our own land." There was pushback, of course. Some officials argued about neighborhood uniformity, property values, and visual standards. But we had the people on our side. And we had proof that gardens didn't bring blight, they brought connection. Eventually, the ordinance passed by a narrow margin, but it passed, and as I stood outside that courthouse, a woman handed me a small basket of fresh strawberries. "These are from my backyard," she smiled. "Thanks to you, I didn't have to dig them up." But even as I celebrated, I knew the fight wasn't over. The HOA still had its own rules. My fine hadn't been dropped, and some residents were still scared to plant a single seed. So, I filed a formal complaint against the HOA board for overstepping community boundaries. It sparked an internal review, and for the first time in years, residents were given a vote on HOA landscaping policies. Over the next month, something amazing happened. People started planting more. You could see tomatoes growing on balconies, small raised beds near driveways, even community garden plots springing up on unused corners. Kids got involved too, painting signs, watering plants, learning where their food came from. Teachers started requesting garden programs in schools. The change wasn't just political, it was cultural. Meanwhile, the original fine they gave me was quietly withdrawn. No apology, no announcement, just a silent deletion from my record. But I didn't need their apology. The garden was still there, thriving, blooming, and every time I walked past it, I felt proud, because they tried to fine me for gardening, but I stood up, and now, we all stand together. I walked back into my house that afternoon, drained but strangely energized. I knew this wasn't over. The town board might have retreated today, but they'd regroup. I'd seen this playbook before. Bully the little guy until he gives up or goes away. But they had picked the wrong person to push around this time. I had years of public service behind me. I had worked with constituents, listened to concerns, and protected citizens from unnecessary regulations. This garden wasn't just about vegetables anymore. It had become a symbol of every overreach, every unnecessary fine, every attempt to punish people for simply trying to live better lives. That evening, I sat with a legal pad, scribbling notes. I called a few neighbors who had also had issues with the local code enforcement team, overgrown grass fines, fence height violations. One woman told me she got cited for having too many flower pots on her porch. I took notes. Then I pulled out my laptop and began crafting a public statement. I would bring this matter into the next county meeting, not just my garden, but a full discussion of the code enforcement culture that had taken root in our town. These people worked for us, not the other way around. I uploaded photos of my garden to social media with a caption. They tried to fine me for growing food, but I'm not backing down. Within hours, it began circulating. By the next morning, it had thousands of shares. People from neighboring towns started commenting. A retired veteran wrote, "They fined me for putting in a rain barrel." A young mother posted, "This is exactly why we moved to the countryside, to escape this kind of control." The outpouring gave me more than support, it gave me evidence, proof that mine wasn't an isolated story. That week, I scheduled an open forum. I invited citizens to come share their experiences with fines, inspections, and zoning restrictions. I reserved the community center and brought in an independent moderator. The night of the event, I expected maybe 30 or 40 people. Instead, over 200 showed up. Elderly farmers, young couples, single parents, veterans, all with stories of being ticketed or threatened by city staff. One man stood and said, "They cited me for not having a permit to fix my own barn. I've owned that land for 40 years. The crowd groaned. Another said, "They fined me for building a treehouse for my daughter." It became clear this wasn't about gardening. This was about power and how it was being used. After the forum, I collected written statements and began preparing a formal presentation for the county board. My message was simple. We need reform, not removal of all rules, but reasonable enforcement, fair hearings, and most of all, respect for property owners. I proposed a review panel of citizens who could weigh in on fines and citations. I suggested we revisit the zoning code, line by line. The board resisted at first. Some of them saw it as me stirring up trouble. But with the public now wide awake and engaged, they had no choice but to listen. Meanwhile, the original fine against my garden was quietly dropped. No apology, no explanation, just gone. I smiled when I got the letter, but I wasn't celebrating yet. Dropping my fine wasn't enough. What about the others? A few weeks later, I was invited to speak on a local radio station. They introduced me as the gardening commissioner. I laughed. It was a strange title, but I didn't mind. The host asked, "Why do you think your garden became such a lightning rod?" I answered, "Because people are tired of being told how to live on their own land." This wasn't about vegetables, it was about control. That line stuck. It started appearing in posts, in editorials, in community meetings. My phone kept ringing. Some calls were supportive, others not so much. A few from within the system told me to back off. They said I was making waves. One even warned, "You're going to lose friends over this." I replied, "Then they weren't friends to begin with." I kept going. One day, I got a letter from a woman in another state. She'd read about my story online. Her town had banned front yard gardens altogether. She said, "I thought I was the only one. Thank you for standing up." That letter reminded me that sometimes, small acts lead to big change. My little patch of tomatoes and kale had sparked something bigger. I couldn't stop now. As summer turned to fall, I kept working. My garden kept growing. And slowly, the system started to bend. The board agreed to a pilot program where citizens could challenge fines before paying. We launched a review of the zoning code. Inspectors were told to use discretion. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. One morning, I was watering my garden. When a kid walked by on his bike, he stopped, looked at the rows of green, and said, "This is yours." I nodded. He said, "My mom said, you fought City Hall." I smiled. "Something like that." He asked, "Why?" I pointed to the tomatoes. "So we can grow this without getting in trouble." He nodded, like he understood. Then he pedaled off. That moment stayed with me, because it reminded me of what was really at stake. Not just freedom, but the idea that doing something good like growing your own food should never be punished. And that's where the real story begins. I stood near the garden gate, watching as people from the neighborhood stopped to glance at the tall sunflowers, the rows of beans, the tomato vines climbing with pride. What had started as a small project of love and sustainability had grown into a symbol. It wasn't just my personal escape anymore. It was a message. That land could be reclaimed, that food could be grown by anyone, and that even in a world of rules, nature deserved its place. That morning, I received yet another letter. Another notice from the zoning committee, demanding I remove certain plantings and threatening a new fine. I held the paper in my hand, reading the bolded words over and over: violation, non-compliance, enforcement. It was as if my garden had become a criminal. I laughed bitterly. I had written these regulations myself, years ago, back when I was part of a different world. But life changes, and we changed too. I called a special county meeting. This wasn't going to be a fight in private. If they wanted to challenge me, they'd have to do it openly, in front of the same community that supported the garden, that had begun donating seeds and coming to learn how to grow their own vegetables. The same neighbors who once asked if they could pick a tomato, now offered to help weed or water while I was away. This wasn't just about a few plants, it was about what kind of town we wanted to live in. At the meeting, I brought photos of kids smiling in the sun, holding carrots still caked with dirt, of elderly residents who had joined our community gardening days, finding joy again in the simple act of planting something. I showed how the garden had helped reduce food insecurity, how we gave away baskets of produce every Saturday. I talked about the bees that had returned, the birds that now nested near the fig tree, the shade provided by our berry bushes. The room was quiet. Then came the zoning officer, clipboard in hand, glasses low on his nose. He started reading from the manual. A monotone list of clauses and paragraphs about setbacks, about public-facing spaces, about the visual integrity of the street. It was everything I'd expected. Cold, technical, distant. I stood up slowly and looked around the room. "You know me," I began. "You voted for me. You've seen what I do. You've walked past my house, or stopped to talk while I pulled weeds or harvested kale. You've shared in this space. This garden is not in violation of our values. It's a reflection of them." And I paused. It's true, the current zoning rules don't support it, but maybe that means the rules need to change. People began nodding. Murmurs of agreement. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about rethinking how we viewed private spaces, how we supported green living, how we encouraged local sustainability. A young woman stood up in the back. "My grandmother got sick," she said, "and the food from your garden, it helped. It wasn't just vegetables, it was care. No grocery store does that." The tide had shifted. I knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. But I also knew I wasn't alone anymore. The council voted to pause all enforcement until further review. A working group was formed with local gardeners, residents, and city officials, and I offered to help lead it. That night, I returned home and stood in the moonlight beside the tall corn stalks. Fireflies danced, a cool wind passed over the soil, and I felt peace, because even though they had tried to find me for gardening, I had planted more than seeds. I had planted hope, and it was growing in every corner of my community. The next few weeks were filled with work. We reviewed the old zoning laws line by line, examining outdated restrictions that prevented people from using their land in ways that were environmentally friendly. We found contradictions, places where lawns were encouraged, but fruit trees weren't, where ornamental plants were praised, but edible gardens were penalized. We started drafting new proposals, allowances for front yard gardens, incentives for native planting, guidelines for composting and water conservation. The focus wasn't just about relaxing the rules, it was about guiding the community toward a more sustainable, respectful relationship with the land. We held public listening sessions, where people could come forward and share their vision. One retired teacher shared how she'd always wanted to create a pollinator garden for local schools. A young couple talked about their plan to raise herbs and donate them to a community kitchen. These weren't radicals or rebels, they were people with love for their soil and dreams rooted in something real. The most touching moment came when a group of children presented their own garden blueprint, drawn in bright crayons complete with sun, bees, and a rainbow. It was messy, it was beautiful, and it reminded everyone in the room why we were doing this. Meanwhile, the garden at my house became a symbol. People came from other towns to visit. Local newspapers ran stories about it. We even had a group of university students come and study the soil health improvements from our regenerative practices. Despite all this, there were still voices of resistance. A few residents worried about property values, some didn't like the look of vegetables in the front yard. One man insisted that gardens belong in the back where no one can see them. But each concern gave us a chance to listen, to educate, and to compromise where needed. We offered to add natural borders around gardens to maintain visual harmony. We shared statistics showing that edible landscaping didn't lower property value in many cases, it increased it. We hosted workshops on garden design to blend beauty with function. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. By the time the new zoning amendments were put to vote, the energy in the room had shifted. What started as a confrontation had turned into collaboration. I watched the votes come in, one by one. The new urban gardening rights passed with overwhelming support. I stepped outside that evening and knelt by my first tomato plant, the one I had almost pulled out when the first vine had come in. I touched the warm soil, breathed in the scent of basil, and smiled. They had tried to find me, but instead, they had fertilized something bigger. The final chapter of this story wasn't just mine. It belonged to every person who had chosen to turn their yard into a space of growth. Every child who learned where food really comes from. Every elder who had found joy again in planting a seed and watching it rise. This wasn't rebellion. This was restoration. And it all started with a garden that refused to be silenced. When the final inspection date came, I stood at my garden gate, arms crossed, watching the two code enforcement officers approach. This time, they came with a third man I hadn't met before. He wore a clean white shirt, clipboard in hand, and looked more like a lawyer than a building inspector. He introduced himself as the city's legal representative for municipal code enforcement. I extended my hand. He hesitated but shook it. "I believe you've been informed why we're here," he said. "I have," I said calmly. "And I hope you've brought an open mind with that clipboard." We walked slowly through the garden. I gave them the full tour, not just the vegetables, but the composting bins, the pollinator plants, the rainwater catchment system. I explained how the garden was helping local food banks. I showed them documentation of donations, receipts from soil tests, and letters of support from neighbors. They asked questions, this time more respectful, less accusatory. I could tell the tone had shifted. After nearly 45 minutes, they left, promising to file a final report. I had done everything I could. Now, it was in their hands, or so I thought. 2 days later, I received a certified letter. It read, "Notice of dismissal, case closed. No further action will be taken." My shoulders dropped. I exhaled, but the real victory wasn't that the case was closed. It was what happened next. At the next public county meeting, I stood before my fellow commissioners, not to defend myself, but to propose something new. "I'd like to introduce a resolution," I said, "to establish a countywide Urban Agriculture Protection Act. It will safeguard the rights of citizens to grow food on their property, within basic safety and zoning parameters. No more code harassment. No more intimidation." There was silence, then murmurs, then applause, not just from the audience, but from two fellow commissioners who had once been skeptical. The vote was unanimous. The resolution passed. It was one of the proudest moments of my public service career. And yet, it didn't come from a campaign or a strategic plan. It started because someone tried to shut down a garden, and I happened to be the wrong person to threaten. Weeks after that, something remarkable happened. I was invited to speak at a local elementary school. The kids had heard about my garden. The story, their teacher said they were inspired and wanted to start a school garden of their own. As I walked through their tiny plot, just a few raised beds, I saw drawings of tomatoes and sunflowers on the classroom walls. One child asked, "Do you think we'll get in trouble for planting here?" That question broke my heart. But I smiled and said, "Not anymore. You have a commissioner who made sure of that." In the months that followed, local gardening took off. Community gardens doubled. Churches started planting raised beds. Schools included food literacy and science class. And people began to feel like they had permission, no, power, to reclaim their soil, their food, and their dignity. And you know what was amazing? Some of the same code officers who had once knocked on my door started showing up at gardening events as volunteers. One of them even emailed me photos of his backyard kale patch, joking that I'd corrupted him. That's what healing looks like, not revenge, not bitterness, but transformation. Now people often ask me, would you have stood up for your garden if you weren't a county commissioner? And the honest answer is yes. Because before I was elected, I was just a man who believed in growing food and living in harmony with the land. But being in office gave me a microphone, a platform, and I realized that if I didn't use it to protect people like myself, like all of us, then I didn't deserve it. This whole experience taught me something powerful. Laws are not set in stone. They're written by people, and they can be rewritten by people. Power doesn't just reside in institutions. It lives in citizens who refuse to be intimidated, who plant seeds, not just in soil, but in systems. That garden wasn't just food, it was resistance, it was healing, it was home. And even now, when I step outside in the evening and water the tomatoes, I remember the day I almost gave it all up. I remember the fear, the anger, the frustration, but more than that, I remember the courage. The neighbor who stood beside me, the kid who asked if gardening was allowed, the officer who changed his mind, the vote that passed unanimously, all of it started with a shovel and a seed. And to anyone listening now who feels small, or helpless, or pushed around by a system that doesn't see you, let me tell you, you have more power than you think. Stand up, speak out, grow something, because the roots you plant today might just change the laws tomorrow.